This is the audio recording for the presentation for Gandhi and India's independence. I will again be focusing on just reading the slides and adding a little bit of information to it because I think that format has helped a lot more people recently. So let's get into it. Next slide. Gandhi. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born in India on October 2nd, 1869, and he studied law in England. After practicing law in South Africa during apartheid, he returned to India in 1914 with a determination that people should be treated equally no matter their race or religion, and he was shocked by the way Indians were segregated and oppressed by British authorities. The apartheid movement we'll talk about more when we get to Africa, but basically it was the idea that under the law, if you were white, you had a lot of rights and a lot of freedoms, and if you were not white, you had way less rights and freedoms. And while the Indians were not quite treated as poorly as the black South Africans were, they were still very much in need of help. And we'll see that again. We'll see that in the movie when we get to it. Next slide. This is a picture of a younger Gandhi, and you can notice most people, when they picture Gandhi, they picture him as later in life with his clothing and stuff like the robe. But this is him actually when he was a lawyer and still had a full head of hair. Next slide. After the Amritsar massacre, Gandhi quit practicing law and decided to devote his life to fighting for the equality of all Indians. We talked about that in the previous presentation. He was enraged at how the British discriminated against Indians. Gandhi believed it was time for the people of India to stop obeying the unjust British laws. Right? He was mad, but notice what it's like. This is a situation where they're saying we're not going to obey the laws anymore. Not a matter of we're going to uprise and fight. It's going to be we're going to not cooperate. Next slide. All right. Nonviolence. Gandhi did not think that forceful resistance was the right path for Indian independence. Instead, he encouraged his followers to practice nonviolent protest against the British in order to bring about social change. Gandhi encouraged Indian followers to disobey unjust British laws in a peaceful manner without using violence. And the idea here is to make sure that they're not going to obey these unjust British laws because they victimize the Indians. And then when the British attempt to, punish them for this, the punishment looks that much more severe because the Indians aren't being violent. So part of this is also to get a sympathy on the from the world for them to be able to say, wow, look at how the Indians are being mistreated. That's not fair to them. Next slide. Right. God is truth. The way to truth lies through ahimsa, which is nonviolence. This is an actual note that Gandhi wrote in 1927, March 13th, 1927. Next slide. Social change. Gandhi developed what he called a system of civil disobedience. That's an important phrase right there, that civil disobedience, and believed that it would make the world recognize the injustice in India and force change without using violence. He believed that acts of goodness produced positive reactions while violence only produced negative ones. Gandhi led his followers in economic boycotts, hunger strikes, and nonviolent protests to oppose the unfair treatment of Indians. All right. And a boycott is something that we've talked about, or we're going to be talking about. It's basically a refusal to buy a product from a certain source, whether it be a store or a country. In this case, they're talking about a country. So they're saying we're not going to buy stuff from the British. The hunger strike thing was more a thing for Gandhi, and we'll talk about that. But basically, that's the idea that he would stop eating and put his own health in jeopardy to create changes that needed to happen. Next slide. This is It says Gandhi on strike with textile workers in 1931, but this is actually during a visit to Britain, Great Britain, England, and he was visiting female textile workers, and they just very much liked him and took to him and understood what he was trying to do. So he actually had some support with the British citizens. Just, it was mainly the British government that didn't like him very much. Next slide. The Salt March. In 1930, Gandhi led a 240-mile march to the ocean to oppose a British tax on salt. Guards responded by clubbing and beating the peaceful protesters. News of this event spread worldwide, and people around the world began to call for the British to grant Indian independence. There were actually, American and other countries had reporters there that that saw this, what was happening and things, and it was reported back that the British soldiers beat these Indian protesters who were not doing anything other than walking, and there were people that were very badly injured. There were some people who were even killed, and that got the world's sympathy. So that created a lot of momentum for the independence of India. Next slide. This is Gandhi during the Salt March. And you can see here he's wearing his clothing. The clothing was actually a form of protest. He made it himself. He took cotton, wove it into the thread, wove the thread into the cloth, and then made his own clothes, what he called homespun. And that was a form of protest because, again, they were not allowed to do that. They were supposed to buy their cloth from the British. Instead, he just made his own. So his own clothing, his actual clothing, was a form of protest. Next slide. Support. Even though Gandhi and his followers practiced nonviolence, the British authorities did not. The Indian protesters suffered brutal beatings and long prison sentences. Despite the dangers, more and more Indians followed Gandhi's wisdom of nonviolent resistance and generated support for nationalism and independence. There were times occasionally where Indian people would, break down and actually have a violent episode or something like that. And if that started to happen, that's when he would do the hunger strike thing where he would stop eating. And the Indian people cared about him so much that they would kind of, come to their senses and decide, we got to stop being violent. We got to calm this down, because if we don't, we're going to lose this guy. And he's been such a help to us. So, but this whole nonviolent movement is really, really successful. Next slide. You can see here British soldiers on horseback who are kind of chasing off and beating the Indian protesters and things. You can see some of the soldiers and stuff that are on horseback. You can see they've got sticks in their hands and clubs, and they're just beating the protesters who are forced to just basically run away. Next slide. This is Gandhi giving a speech to a large group of people, and this is after Amritsar. So again, this is one of the things that it could be very dangerous for him to do this. They know what has happened, but he also knew that the British didn't want to duplicate that same problem at Amritsar again. So, but still, this is one of the common things that he would call for, was people to take clothing they had bought from the British and burn it, to kind of just go back to the whole homespun concept of making their own clothes. Next slide. Independence. After fighting in World War II, Britain no longer had enough money or people to keep India under its control. Great Britain finally agreed to give up their colonial claims to India. And on August 15th, 1947, the Republic of India was established. And today, many Indians credit India's independence to the efforts of Gandhi. This didn't come without problems, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. But, and this also took a long time. It's one of the things when you look at it in history and think, okay, well, they got independence. Yeah, but it took a long chunk of time and many, many years to get this to work. But it was one of the things that by doing so, by taking a long time, it actually lasts. Next slide. You can see this is India's Independence Day. This is actually in the courtyard of the main government building. Next slide. Um, Many Indians lovingly call Mohandas Gandhi Mahatma, which means great soul. So if you ever hear somebody talking about Mahatma Gandhi, that's who they're talking about. But it's kind of a title or an affectionate nickname or however you want to word it. But it's definitely something where people confuse it because you have Mohandas and Mahatma. They sound alike. I always like this picture of Gandhi, by the way, just because the way he's smiling. It looks like he got away with something. Like, I took the cookies. I don't know. Next slide. A split India. All right. Even though India had won its independence, things were not peaceful in the country. Hindus and Muslims could not reach a solution as to how to rule an independent India. Eventually, the country was split into India for the Hindus and Pakistan for the Muslims. This happened on the Independence Day. But basically, what happened was any place that had a majority Muslim population became Pakistan, and any place that had a majority Hindu population became India. And the issue on that was the fact that the Muslims were the majority on two separate sides of the country. So Pakistan started off um, on both sides. It was actually split in half, and eventually the part that was the eastern part becomes Bangladesh. But it was just a really bad situation. A lot of people had to move and change houses and change homes and stuff, and it was just bad. Next slide, which has nothing on it apparently. Oh, never mind. It kind of fades in. Look at that. There's British India, and there is after the independence thing where you had this Pakistan part that's over there, and then you have Myanmar and a bunch of stuff that's way on out there, and then Bangladesh kind of in the middle. These are two Muslim men carrying an elderly woman to their new home in Pakistan. So, like I said, people, if you were Muslim and you were living in the part of India that would become India, you would be worried because you're now a major minority. So you saw a lot of people, a lot of Muslims left and moved to Pakistan. Same thing if you were Hindu and living in what was going to become Muslim Pakistan. A lot of you got nervous about that, so you ended up moving and going back to actual what was going to be the new country of India, and that obviously created a lot of anger and people getting upset. People got sick and died on this trip, so there was a lot of bad feelings about the whole thing. Next slide. Turmoil. The partition of India led to genocide. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed in widespread violence. Gandhi was very much disappointed by the partition because he wanted all Indians to live together peacefully in one country. Even though he was Hindu, he felt that all religious groups should be welcomed in India. And he actually he read about all the different religions, and so he was very familiar not only with Hinduism, but he was also familiar with um, Islam. He was familiar with Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism. So he knew very much about a lot of these different religions. Next slide. This is a Time magazine cover representing the partition of India. This is from 1947, and what you see here is kind of one of the many different Hindu gods. In this case, the god is actually stabbing itself because of the fact that it's causing so many problems. The idea that this independence thing, India's hurting itself. Next slide. In 1948, at the age of 78, Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated on his way to a prayer meeting in New Delhi. He was shot 3 times by a high-ranking Brahmin who resented Gandhi's concern for Muslims. So Gandhi wasn't killed by another group. Gandhi is Hindu, but he was killed by a Hindu who didn't want to treat the Muslims well, didn't want the Muslims in the country, wanted them completely out and whatnot, and knew that Gandhi would be a hard force to overcome. It would be very hard to overcome Gandhi's efforts to keep peace between Hindus and Muslims, and so he decided to assassinate Gandhi. So it was just a very, very unfortunate thing in terms of the peace in that country, because even today Pakistan and India do not get along very well at all. They do not like each other. So bad, it was a bad scene. Next slide. And this is the memorial where Mohandas Gandhi was assassinated. This is really the only memorial you can go to for Gandhi. He doesn't have a grave, and I'm not going to explain that because I'm pretty sure you already know why. And we'll talk about that in class. That's it.